Cheers.
Cheers. Welcome to Beer Boys.
To liberty and prosperity.
The Sapporo Black Label.
Last time we talked about Omelas, so I'm going to lead us into this reading with a related quote.
Okay.
When we are reminded, as more and more frequently happens, that one cannot make omelets without breaking eggs, the eggs which are broken shut up. The eggs which are broken are almost all of the kind which a generation or two ago were regarded as the essential basis of civilized life.
Right. Definitely should have vetted that before. Hello everyone.
Hello.
It's 17th of July 2023. It's kind of a shitty day. I don't know, the weather recently has just been like raining and hot and humid and just like can't make up its mind. I had to walk 40 minutes to get to Phil's house today, so I'm predictably covered in sweat.
Have some apologetic smoked cheese.
Thank you.
Which is going to make loud noises as you open it.
We should have used this as the opening sound.
The opening cheese. No, we're going to eat the cheese at the same time so no one can talk.
Yeah. Whilst I eat the cheese, you can tell people what we're reading this week.
This week we're reading The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, which is one of my favorite books from one of my favorite thinkers.
Cool.
How did you like it? No pressure.
I was mixed feelings. There are times where I thought it was very prescient and like very like I don't know, some of the stuff being talked about was very clear and very interesting. There were times where I thought things were quite obvious and he was kind of going on a little bit too long about some things.
I do agree.
There were other times where I thought it was just kind of like straight up crack pipe. Like we can get into that.
Okay. Well, yeah. On the regard of obviousness, like you can feel that this is like written in a very different time, right? Where a lot of the insights that we have today were not obvious at all. In fact, were the kind of minority opinion.
It was published in 1944, so
yeah,
basically just as the war was winding down, and obviously there's like throughout the book this, you know, a lot of the discussion centers around the Soviet Union and the Nazis and stuff like that. But it's interesting because it is kind of like this bridge between pre-war and post-war like Europe and America, I guess, as well, and so you kind of get a glimpse of what like 19th century, you know, the West was like in the 19th century, and the kind of trajectory that he sees it going on today, or rather in the 1940s. Yeah.
Yeah, so Hayek is kind of making a defense for classical liberalism in this book, which is not to be confused with the modern notion of the word liberal, which we understand to mean leftist, maybe in the American sense.
Maybe more like, how do you say, like, social democrat.
Which, as Hayek will tell us, is basically what do you call it? An oxymoron, social democracy.
Yeah. So yeah, this is quite a, I don't know, pretty conservative economic book in some ways. And
disagree very much.
Libertarian economics in other ways.
Disagree very much with that. I'd say Hayek, from my perspective, he's way more like out there on things like welfare and like.
Yes, sure.
So he is, you know, like later, even Mises, who is his teacher, and also later Austrians like Rothbard, are, you know, way more on the libertarian side. I think Hayek is probably the most like centrist, least conservative of the Austrian economists, probably.
If we're talking about like compared to Mises and stuff, sure. But I think maybe in the grand scheme of things, like he attacks like leftism pretty viciously throughout this whole thing, right?
Well, I think he's making a. Well, we'll get into that, but I think he's making a case against planning, and really, the big thing is that it's not about left or right. That there's a false dichotomy here, and that's really against planning. Okay, yeah. Maybe we'll just get into it.
I'm also glad you said that actually, because I think one of the misunderstandings of this book is that it's how do I say, like, strictly attacking like leftism.
When really,
to be honest, I think this is one of the biggest problems I had with the book was like the definition of socialism and why the word socialism was used throughout the book as this like thing to attack, right? So I think this is maybe a good place to start actually, because socialism obviously is, the word socialism is consistently used throughout as this thing that he's like railing against, and it's never like, there's never like an explicit definition given, I don't think, of socialism in the book, but
okay, we'll come to that. To just give a brief premise of the book as well, it's the road to serfdom, right? So he's talking about how England, where he's writing the book, has been echoing a lot of the kind of center planning, like ideological, statements, I guess, or passions, which led to the establishment of planning in pre-Hitler Germany. And he's writing this as like a defense of liberalism, and like saying, if we go down this road that a lot of former liberals or socialists in England were echoing basically Hitler's philosophy. He's saying that we're going down the road to totalitarianism, to serfdom.
Yeah. And liberalism, as he describes, is like essentially like individual freedom, minimal like government interference in like free market and stuff like that.
Individualism, competition. Yeah. As opposed to some kind of like planning from above. Yes.
Interference in markets by governments, like specifically.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about. I'm just gonna go through my notes, and you, I guess, like go through yours as we go through the book chronologically, right?
Sure.
So yeah, in the intro, he establishes again that there is a danger in the UK and US of embarking on this road to serfdom, and one of the big things that he mentions is that fascism and Nazism, which really is kind of the same thing, is not a reaction against, but a consequence of socialist trends.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, his mission in the outset of this book is really to understand the forces which created National Socialism. And even though he attacks planning and socialism in this book, he really talks not at all about the Soviet Union, really not. And part of that, I think, is that at the time there was very, very little information in the Western sphere on what was actually fucking happening over there.
And it was by no means over as well.
Right, but for the vast majority of the book, he criticizes the German model of planning, right? Okay, so yeah, my first really instinct from his intro is that he really does seem very sincere in what few have taken, I think, seriously, is really understanding what created National Socialism, and not falling into this dichotomy of left and right to simply say, oh, the answer to right-wing totalitarianism is left-wing totalitarianism, but to understand kind of that there is a more underground force between authoritarianism and liberalism that is really driving this trend, and that the distinction between left-wing totalitarianism, right-wing totalitarianism is really an arbitrary distinction. And especially in like, if I recall like my German middle school education, we always had these like campaigns like in school, like against right-wing politics, against racism, against blah blah blah. And there definitely are still neo-Nazis in Germany today, but there's always this kind of at least in the education system, there was always this like kind of silly like, oh, if we only like preach inclusivity and tolerance and diversity and inclusion and blah blah blah, then we're gonna like overcome this threat of Nazism, which, you know, if Hayek saw this, he would say that, well, this is all good and tolerance is great and so on, but really the threat is planning. It's not any like particularly, it's not any particular manifestation of planning and its characteristics, such as being particularly German or being particularly anti-bourgeois or anti-Jewish or anti-blah blah blah. It's really the planning is the central threat behind.
Sure. That's his original argument, right?
Right. So he says, don't hate Germanness, hate the ideas which have led to modern.
Yeah, and I mean this is pretty obvious now. Like, we don't today consider that there's anything inherent about Germans that leads to Nazism. But obviously at the time, like, it was 1944, and where explanations were trying to be given about how this thing happened. Yeah, so I mean, the way that I see it, like the idea of planning being one, like, I mean, essentially the idea of like state control and like relinquishing control of things to the state, as this like thing that led to Nazism. I mean, it feels like, sure, that this is one aspect of things, but I mean, the conventional explanation today is like talks about like the rise of nationalism after World War One, reparations after World War One, poverty and inflation in Germany and stuff, and then this desire to seek a totalitarian, like a strong man that can like lead people out of bad situations, lead people out of this like awful situation that Germany had become, right? And so whilst I see that, like, of course this thing could only transpire if this thing can only occur if the state was given power, and if the public believed that a strong man who could be an authority and control the state and lead people to glory and whatever, if people believed that was like a solution, that's like, what was I saying? Like, clearly the Nazi state would not exist without state power, right? But I'm also not sure it's like the only thing that necessarily like led that to be the case, right? Because we have, I mean, there are countries around the world, including like in Europe and America, who are obviously, you know, on that Allied side, which also had like, you know, state control to some degree, right?
And this is where Hayek makes the important distinction of, because Hayek does not advocate laissez-faire.
Yes, he's not an anarchist.
Yeah, like, and he does advocate for even a welfare state and even UBI and things like that. So the big distinction that he makes is policies which foster competition and which seek to supplant competition.
Yes,
that's his big point on the economic side, right?
So this is one thing that I do like about his, as far as like arguments for capitalism that I've seen, this is the one that makes the most sense to me. Because when people tend to argue towards capitalism, like, they don't tend to have like an argument. You know, like I don't really like big companies, and I think most people don't. And whilst I know that many people are, like, they don't give a shit, and it's like, if the company can do a good service for me, then whatever. You know, I'd share that to a degree, but I also think there is a lot of good that smaller, like, perspectives from smaller groups of people can like give. And whereas like people who are like strong advocates of capitalism would kind of obtusely be like, oh, I don't care about like the mom and pop like grocery store or whatever. Like we need big fucking supermarkets here and there, and we need big car parks and whatever. The idea of competition, focusing on competition specifically, is more like, I don't know, more tolerable to me, because it's like, it doesn't focus on anyone in particular, right?
Well, I guess, to just address that, I guess my first thing would be that I don't think there's any actual classical liberal or even libertarian who necessarily argues for big companies.
Yes, sure.
And in fact, I would say it's quite the opposite, and we'll get into that a bit later.
Yeah.
Where there was this Marxist idea that, as capitalism advances, the inevitable outcome is monopoly, because, bigger capitals command stronger, kind of competitional force in the market.
Economies of scale.
And then eventually you'll just end up with one big company, which turns out not to quite be the case. And what Hayek also indicates in this book, and which I think we have seen, especially in modern Western countries, is that like the big kind of oligopoly, monopoly structures that we have in the industries that we do are completely government-induced. And that really a defense of capitalism is a defense of the small businesses.
Yeah, I think I agree to an extent. This conversation is going to take hours.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems, the only problem I have with that idea though, is that it's like the liberal mindset wouldn't have an answer for if it happened to produce one monopoly that took care of everything, right? So there would be no answer, because it's like this thing has happened, and then it's we should not interfere with it.
The American answer that Hayek also references is that you have anti-monopoly laws. And that, so basically, it is the state's role in classical liberalism, the state's role to foster competition. So if the free market would produce a monopoly, which, by the way, I personally don't think it ever will, but that if this would be the case, that you would have laws that foster competition, so anti-monopoly laws, anti-cartel laws. So his answer in that case would be state intervention.
Yeah, and he does talk about that, like the project of the liberal state, like to like paraphrase, he says something like the project of like the liberal government is to essentially refine these laws, which produce competition, right?
And that he kind of lays down this basic principle of competition, and he allows for a lot of room within like variability. So different nations would have entirely different welfare states or entirely different ways in dealing with this principle of fostering competition. And he says that is all within the grand liberal spirit.
And I think he's also like, so you said like he's, well, I remember we talked about this before, when you suggested we do this book, I kind of like rolled my eyes, because I was like, yeah, we're going into this, fine. And you were like, oh no, don't worry, he's not like that extreme.
Yeah.
And yeah, in all fairness, like, he even acknowledges, I think in the first or second chapter, that like there are places in society where competition is not justified or competition is not necessary. In the case of like social welfare and stuff, right?
Well, I think he says that there are cases where we can give people like the basic means to like of subsistence without endangering the principle of competition.
Sure. But like when he talks about like roads, for example, roads and signposts.
Yes.
Like he's,
we'll get to that.
This is like the whole like this is one of like it's so funny like when you talk about libertarianism, because it's like boils down to like the most like mundane questions, like how are you going to do roads? What about bridges?
Well, I'm happy to have an hour talk on that when we read Rothbard, which we will eventually.
But the point is that he says at some point, like, there are some places where it might not be necessary to have like perfect privatization or
or
competition with certain things. It
in
just
areas-
doesn't make sense.
in areas where competition can't function properly,
Yes. Yeah.
like having the state supply certain marginal services is not going to endanger the whole spirit of competition.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So let's get back on track. Okay, so another thing mentioned in the intro of the book is that the left and right in Germany were both. First of all, they were both socialist, and eventually became National Socialist, and that really the one unifying thing about German politics is that there was no liberalism. That the liberals had died out a generation prior,
Right.
and that what also aided the rise of National Socialism. And we talk about this transition from Prussianism, Bismarck's kind of bureaucratic state, to socialism, to National Socialism.
So I think we need to kind of talk about this definition of socialism, because I think
yes, but I don't.
This is.
Should we get to that just yet?
I mean,
okay,
it's the
most
right. fundamental part of this book, I think.
Fair enough. Okay, so
I don't know. I'm kind of confused by this, to be honest, because he talks about his definition of socialism is, well, as far as I can come, he doesn't say socialism is this,
he
but
does.
Okay, well, it's central planning, right? That's the essential definition, right?
It's basically applied collectivism.
Okay, what is collectivism?
Collectivism is the idea that it is the individual is not responsible for its own action and goals, but rather the collective, and that collective can be chosen on any arbitrary kind of group identity factors. So in Germany, that would be the Aryan race, the German race, blah blah blah.
Well, I don't understand why he's used the word socialism when there's already a pretty established definition of what socialism is, state-owned means of production, no private property.
I don't think he disagrees with that.
But the Nazis were not socialists by that definition.
Absolutely, they were.
I don't think they were.
100%.
There's state corporatists.
Yeah.
There was private property, private production.
To a very, very limited degree. I would say that the distinction between really fascism and communism is one of very slight degree.
But they're still different. I think they're still quite. It's worth making the distinction.
I guess if you wanted to I would make a graph of to what degree does the state own property? At 0%, you would have a completely free market economy. Then from somewhere from 0 to 50%, you would have social market economy, modern day England, Germany, US.
Yeah.
And then probably from 50 to 90%, somewhere there's fascism. And then from 90 to 100%, there's communism. So I think it's an issue of degree, but then they're not opposites.
But it would make, if it was an issue of degree, it would make no sense why we went from socialism to Nazism. That would be a regression, right?
Well, from socialism to National Socialism, he talks about that a bit later in the book, why socialism doesn't necessarily devolve into national politics. Why socialism cannot be international.
Okay, yeah. But my main point is that the definitions aren't the same, and I don't know. I feel that I don't know, people on the right, for example, even just general critics of leftism, they often criticize how the left likes to change definitions and equate certain things that aren't equatable, and it just seems kind of obtuse to lump these things in as exactly the same things.
No, I would actually say that Hayek has produced the only coherent definition of socialism I've ever seen in my entire life.
Okay.
I would go that far.
Well, maybe disrespectfully disagree then. I don't understand though how the Nazis would send, if they send socialists to concentration camps, who are they sending?
Well, then they're sending...
The Nazis persecuted socialists.
Well, in the idea of Bolsheviks and so on, right? But I think it's really this is a kind of a quarrel with words, but it is very important. So really, if we see socialism as applied collectivism as government planning.
Yeah.
I think that's a very coherent definition of socialism, and it makes sense in the sense of the word, and also makes sense if you look at the actual policies that are pursued.
I don't know. I just think that there's no reason why another would not be chosen for that, because there's a definite distinction between Nazism and socialism.
Between National Socialism and socialism.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think is that difference?
Well, Nazism, there existed private property, there existed private corporations, whereas the ideal socialist model, those things don't exist.
Well, that would be communism, like complete abolition of.
But socialism is just defined by like state ownership of property.
Okay, so how would you differentiate socialism and communism?
I mean, I don't know if I would.
So then I would really say that what you're arguing is socialism is understood as communism.
So, well, what's the difference between socialism and communism to you?
For me, it's that under communism you have complete state ownership of all means of production, whereas in socialism that's only partly true.
To what degree?
It's not exactly defined, but it would have to be, well, more than 50%, right? So, like the state throws around more weight in economic decisions than the free market. So, for example, Poland under the Soviet Union and like the East Germany, those were socialist countries, right?
I guess so.
Like certainly that was according to themselves and like pretty much everyone, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be any private property at all. It just means that the government's control of private property is so tight that, you know, it's really the government who consciously directs the goals of the planned economy more so than kind of a free decentralized network. So like even in communism, realistically, you cannot have no private property at all. Like
sure.
At some point, like someone's gonna own like their own fucking hat or something,
their
right? Their own clothes and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. But I mean that would be like you could say that that's like impossible to fully achieve, but yeah, obviously we make some like exceptions.
Right. Well, I would say, for example, so in the National Socialist and the fascist case, first of all, we're going to get into the history of how socialism became National Socialism really overnight, kind of. But on the fact of how does government really control, in the fascist model, it's not there's kind of an illusion of private property, where you leave a very, very small government-chosen elite, bureaucratic elite, to manage big companies like, for example, Volkswagen.
Yeah.
But if this was really private property, you know, you would assume that there was like a board of directors and stockholders, and they could like decide what they do with the company. That's not the case. The government dictates to every dot of I and every dash of the T, completely dictates what the company does. Completely dictates at what price what is bought and what is sold, and like at least in regards to like the war economy, right? So you would have
okay, but then war economy is a completely different thing. You could probably argue that any war economy is communist.
Not
or at
communist,
least
but
socialist by definition.
Yes, and that's also a point touched upon
sure.
in the book, right?
But then that wouldn't describe the Nazi model specifically. That would just describe Nazis during wartime, right?
No, well, because I guess the takeover of companies was before war even started. But,
sure.
So like, if the government decides what is produced and like how much is necessary and like where certain resources are to be allocated, it doesn't really matter if on paper the company is owned by some guy who the government put there, or if it's owned by the government, right? Like that distinction is essentially like a very small distinction of degree, I would say.
And was it the case that the Nazis they appointed people to be in specific companies?
Well, for obviously, if you were a dissident, you would just be executed, right?
Sure.
So, like, you would naturally thin out everyone until the person who rises to the top is actually the guy who does exactly what you want, and if he does not, he will be killed. So it's less of a case where you get a letter from the government of like, you have been chosen to be the head of Toyota. But it's like basically, we bet like the guy in charge better do exactly what we want him to do, or like his family's gonna be dead next morning.
Sure. So yeah, I don't know. I guess there's room for nuance.
So yeah, I guess like a challenging, like to our like established perceptions of socialism and planning is that really the thesis Hayek makes is that collectivism applied is socialism. Socialism is planning. So we're just gonna have to equate socialism and planning, at least like if we're gonna work with his words, and then we can disagree on like what we understand today as socialism, right? So we equate socialism and planning, or he does that, and then he says also, so there's a like intellectual framework called collectivism, and if we apply that to actual policy, then that's planning or socialism, and that really there are left-wing iterations and right-wing iterations of socialism.
So okay, yeah. I mean, the bottom line is I mean it's semantic for me. Like if you could, whatever application of collectivism clearly applies with both right and left wing, and we've talked about this like in previous episodes of the podcast. I think like Genesis, when we're talking about like the Conservative Party in America, and like supposedly being small government, but actually really favoring government intervention in specific like ideological points of contention. And I do think that this is like a good like contribution from this book, like, and just a different way of thinking about political theory, instead of just being, I mean, like political compass or like right left or whatever. Instead being this kind of like almost like kind of T-shaped thing, where you have like liberalism at the bottom of the T or something, and then on the other side of that line is, authority. And then it can branch out in different ways to different manifestations, whether it's right or left. I do recognize that.
Okay. Let me go to some other notes, I guess. So chapter 1, we talk about kind of the decline of liberalism, right? So he talks about how in the last 25 years, so from 1944, that there has really been a move from liberal ideology to socialist ideology. And again, by that he means planning.
Yes. Yeah.
Center planning. So in not just Germany, but also the kind of English intellectual class. And so he says the success of liberalism was its declining cause, that the wealth of freedom became taken for granted that liberalism produced. Right. And and that liberalism is a negative creed. That is to say that it only denies new positive action to like benefit a particular group. So that the way that center planners would advocate for their policies is to give like kind of pork barrel, dangle certain promises to certain interest groups and say, we're going to make sure that you get this, we're going to make sure that you get this. So center planners always had the advantage of like promising a certain group something, so they would rally a certain support group. Whereas liberalism is negative in nature, to say that no specific group should get any advantage by government. And therefore liberalism, even though it benefits everyone according to Hayek, doesn't really have a core support group, because it doesn't really preach to any particular group.
And if anything, this is kind of like, I don't know, almost, so this book is quite optimistic, I guess, at the end, but I don't think when you consider the political environment, and especially like, I don't know, how politics like works today it's always just a case of like making promises for your specific group and then trying to collect votes on that, and then trying to enact them where possible, even though it doesn't quite matter anymore because you've already kind of gotten what you needed, which was like the power and the vote that you wanted. So yeah, whether like, I mean, maybe we should talk about this later, but like the actual applicability of this today, and like whether it's like an achievable, whether
the
it's
applicability of what?
Of liberalism, whether by what means you would advocate for, and by what means you could imagine it being like achieved, like a more kind of liberalist state.
It's a hard sell, right? And that's kind of the thing he's trying to point out, that it's a hard sell because there's really no core group which to advertise liberalism for, and that in order to, I guess, understand the supposed benefits of liberalism, you would have to reject the offers of other politicians who promise you certain tangible things right now.
Yes. And today when you consider how like political campaigns are just essentially a form of bargaining. Did you see like the Ron DeSantis?
I did not.
Made this like internet brained like online. It was like vertical video, campaign video, which is just like it cuts in like loads of like stupid memes like American Psycho and shit, and like the Chad face and whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like Ron DeSantis, he's like advocated for like 73 anti-trans laws, and it's like for the target demographic, it's like, oh hell yeah, he's doing exactly what I want him to do, like and it's just like I think one thing that Hayek points out is that like it's like there's almost like this tendency of the non-liberal state to just see rules as like a necessary thing, and like a state which is not kind of constrained by liberal, like strictly liberal values, will just grow and grow into like this huge ball of different rules and ideas.
Yeah, I think that's kind of
not ideas, but things that it's responsible for.
Yeah. So, like as we've observed, basically the progression of Western democracies post World War II, there has been a very directed, like, procedural expansion of the state, right? Expansion of government that, like, more and more this, more and more that. And it's really, there's kind of a question of, well, where does it end? Because if we're just striving towards infinity, this is eventually the road to serfdom, right?
Yeah.
You can, like, be like, oh, but adding, like, another thing of this and adding another thing of that, it's not gonna destroy democracy, and it's not. But, like, eventually this will be the complete direction of the economy, right? Unless we have certain periods where we realize, okay, it's too much, we need to build down some of the regulation, right?
Yes, it's having an answer to this, like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, by the way, while I was reading this, and obviously I heavily disagree with Hayek's economic policy, but I was kind of thinking that, he's like you would probably agree with his actual policy prescriptions, like,
which ones?
Close to 100%, like all of them.
Well, like welfare and
like to stuff. Have like a generally market-oriented state, but with certain institutions like welfare and UBI that you would not destroy competition, but could give people basic means to survive and things like that.
It's definitely the more like I'm like reflexively like I see libertarianism, and I like.
Well, he's really not a libertarian at all.
That's but he tends towards libertarianism.
No,
right?
I don't think so. No, he tends to. This is liberalism, right? And this is, I think, a really important distinction.
Yeah, fair enough.
No libertarian would be like, yeah, Hayek.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, I think I do. But I don't know. I mean, I find it very difficult to make any specific like. To label myself any specific way.
Right.
But it definitely, in terms of like. Finding a way of just like giving people just fucking the means to live. I don't know. I agree with that for sure.
Okay. So, chapter 2. Okay, he's talking about early socialism, kind of the roots of socialism.
The chapter's called The Great Utopia.
Which started out as an anti-revolution movement in France. So, and really the early socialists, he points out, were explicitly authoritarian and anti-freedom. So later they kind of developed this tendency of democratic socialism and so on, and like let's have our cake and eat it too.
Right.
But the early socialists in France were like explicitly very clear on the fact that individualism and personal freedom is the enemy, and that the state needs absolute control of everything. Kind of as a backdrop. And then, so we talk about the two visions of freedom, which we actually touched upon in the Omelas thing, right?
Yeah.
Freedom from coercion and freedom from necessity.
Yeah.
And I think this is so well put, freedom from necessity. It's way better stated than whatever I said in our last recording.
We are amateurs after all.
So freedom from coercion would be, again, the liberal vision of freedom. That is freedom from government control.
Yes, yeah.
Freedom from a man in boots telling you what to do.
Yeah.
And then the socialist view of freedom would be freedom from necessity. That is to say, I don't have to worry about...
It should be equity, right?
Yeah.
Effectively.
Well, I wouldn't say that, because equity is more like everyone has to be equalized. But freedom from necessity in the sense that you don't have to think about where does the food come from, where do I sleep?
Yeah.
So socialism really is trying to promise to eradicate the scarcity of nature. Any points on that?
I mean, not particularly. But I think it was a fair distinction.
So yeah, he talks about this redefinition of freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
And he quotes a guy called John Dewey, who says, "Liberty is the effective power to do specific things." So liberty is not freedom from coercion, but freedom from necessity. That is to say, you don't you have the power, for example, to go where you want, to eat what you want, and to do your hobbies that you want.
And this is like the distinction between positive and negative freedom, right? Positive freedom being the ability to do stuff, negative freedom being the freedom of coercion from other things.
Right, but
we get that in utilitarianism, right? We talk about that in utilitarianism.
Yes, we do. But I think the point that he's trying to get at is that liberty, that a lot of the confusion about freedom comes from the fact that liberty was redefined as power.
Right.
Agency,
I think, is a good word as well.
Yeah, where is this, John? I have the page open. Oh, well. Oh, right, okay. Max Eastman, very interesting character. Was Lenin's friend, lived for the Soviet Union for over a decade, I think.
Yeah. I remember this guy.
Yeah, we should read this quote. Could you read from Mr. Max Eastman too, whenever you think it's fit to stop?
Mr. Max Eastman, Lenin's old friend, who found himself compelled to admit that, quote, "Instead of being bitter, Stalinism is worse than fascism, more ruthless, barbarous, unjust, immoral, anti-democratic, unredeemed by any hope or scruple," end quote, and that it is, quote, "better described as super-fascist," end quote. And when we find the same author recognizing that, quote, "Stalinism is socialism in the sense of being an inevitable, although unforeseen political accompaniment of the nationalism and collectivism which he had relied upon as part of his plan for erecting a classless society," end quote, his conclusion clearly achieves wider significance.
Okay, I think this is another point of why Hayek makes this bridge from socialism to fascism. Is if you just look at the outcomes, they really are the same.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't really point out any specific thing that's really different, except that like again with the problem of degrees is that the more state control you have, obviously the less effective the economy runs. So that the only real difference in outcomes between fascism and communism is that in communism most of the people killed are the own workers in the country, because there was hard starvations, whereas in fascism there was some degree of economic functionality that most of the people killed were outsiders.
Yeah, and not just being killed through the inefficiency of central planning in like the Soviet Union, but more also as well like the kulaks as well, right?
Yes, like very directed starvation, right?
But you see what the point I'm trying to make is you see like the distinction generally. I don't know if it was made by Hayek specifically, but there's the ethnic quality to Nazism, and to an extent in the Soviet Union as well. But what's generally more emphasized is like class, right? In the Soviet Union being a target for.
Yes, we can make that point, and I would say this is like we've come to think, and this is really like a big, like fundamental thing in our contemporary understandings of fascism and socialism. Is fascism is like racist and socialism is classist, which Hayek is kind of the point that he's trying to make is that, well, what they really are is planning, and that this distinction of ethnic and classism or whatever, they're really just like, there always needs to be some kind of enemy that needs to be united against, and the choice of that enemy is really completely arbitrary, except that it has to like somehow be connected to the culture of the country that you're in. So for the Germans, the bridge to anti-Semitism was an easy one to make, because like there was already like a pre-established anti-Semitism in Germany.
Yeah.
But also as we go in later, that really this like the fight between the new order socialism and the old order liberalism was like hyped up by the socialists before Hitler even came in. That this was really seen as the inevitable war against England.
Right.
And that the Jew symbolized for the socialists, as for the National Socialists, the evil capitalist. That was really the enemy. And so the Jew was antagonized not just in fascist countries, but also in socialist countries and in the USSR, where they were also killed.
I don't know enough about that, but I definitely agree with the fact that, like, I mean, there are a lot of people who are, like, opportunists, I guess. Like, socialism was so popular in Europe around the time that, I mean, in a way it was kind of hard. It kind of seems to me that it was kind of hard to gain any political traction if you didn't use the idea of socialism, even, in name even itself. And, like, when the Nazis came to power, like, unions weren't really a thing, and union people were thrown into concentration camps, but also in the Soviet Union as well, right? Like, we had worker movements that were crushed by Lenin and by Stalin. I think Stalin especially. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is also probably why people argue that socialism has never been achieved, because these like ideals which are held as sacrosanct in like Marxism, like worker democracy, workers' rights, and stuff like that, tend to get completely swept away, or in these examples they get completely swept away when state control is strongly achieved.
And Hayek talks about this again on the point of socialism, where there's really two ideas of socialism. One is a certain ends, the idea of utopian worker society, and another idea of socialism is the means necessary to achieve it. And the claim Hayek makes is that the only possible means to achieve the supposed ends of socialism are planning. And that because of this necessity, because there is no other way to achieve socialist means, socialism is planning. That's why he equates them.
Right.
So he does like make a point of discussing that there is like a distinction in like theory, but in practice, socialism is the same as planning, and that's why he uses that word, I think, in the same sense.
I think the next question as well is kind of like at what point. So you said earlier like 50% state planning equals socialism, which is maybe a fair definition, but like what would be like a so like he kind of one question that I kind of had is like to what extent can we tolerate, like how far can we go up this proverbial road before we get to serfdom,
right?
You know, like because you know that, I mean, we talked about like Scandinavia last week, and I was thinking about what you were saying about it not being like a socialist country in itself, which is, I think, is a fair point. And you know, you probably equate it more with like, I mean, I guess like social democracy and liberalism to some degree. Oh, good job.
That's like the thing, sorry.
And
keep talking, I'm just getting beers.
You throw me off. You should have asked me to do it.
You were talking, you were making a point.
My question, my fundamental question is like, how much planning can we tolerate? And because, you know, like we've already established that like there are, and actually even Hayek admits at one point that like good totalitarianism or good authoritarianism is good, like later on in the book.
Oh, I would say the opposite.
I think he says that though.
No, I think he makes the point that there is no good totalitarianism, and he like details why in totalitarianism always the worst people rise to power.
We'll have to find the quote.
Well, we'll talk about that later. Save that.
But the main question is like, is there a level of planning which is acceptable, basically?
Right.
And is it the case that like going on this road will inevitably lead to serfdom, as he says?
Well, I think to consider that question, we can look at modern day, like current China, and ask that question. So China, I would say, is really an interesting example right now on this, like, how much does the state own graph. We're probably hovering somewhere between 40 and 50%, I would guess.
Okay.
So it's basically a tightrope walk between like barely functioning social market economy and fascism. And like, how much can we tolerate? Well, like the more you move along that curve, the more things deteriorate, right? Or I guess move towards total planned economy. So
yeah,
like I don't think there's necessarily a like clear cutoff point where we can say this is the point where it becomes a socialist economy versus a market economy. But you can look at China today, which is kind of in between, and ask yourself, would you tolerate that?
Yeah. I think this is another one of the kind of issues that I had, I guess, with the book is that, just the idea that because it conflicts with principles, with like liberal principles, and because, I mean, we assume that it inevitably leads to serfdom, that there's no kind of appropriate spot in the middle where we can find ourselves some kind of like good, right? And and then because I mean, you know, you can I mean, China, like, to speak of China, you know, the last 50 years or so of the Chinese economy has like lifted so many people out of poverty, right? But
that is to the degree that it abandoned socialist values and embraced capitalist values or liberal values.
Yeah, no, sure, but
right.
I mean, my point is that it's kind of doing both, right?
Well, it moved along that curve, and then it's been regressing in the last 10 years or so under Xi Jinping or whatever, right? So they use. I'm actually not super educated on this, but I had my Chinese
No, me neither either.
friend told me about it. Like there was like a planning board that like directed a lot of the policy, and then basically Xi Jinping came in, like fired a bunch of the people, and like established himself as dictator.
Yeah.
Okay, but not to get too deep on this China thing. Another thing I wanted to mention is, and this is maybe one of my favorite quotes from the book, which is actually whose quote is this by? Mr. F.A. Vogt, some German political philosopher, which you're not gonna like this.
Okay.
But I think this is one of the most profound insights, is that Marxism has led to fascism and National Socialism because, in all essentials, it is fascism and National Socialism.
Yeah, I remember this one. Yeah.
Which I think
I was just reading this and I was like why?
well, I think it couldn't be truer, really. Like, because all the goals really that, like again coming to the ends and the means thing, like
right.
the ends which Marxism aims at, will necessitate the same means as fascism. Necessitates. Yeah.
Right.
And so once you end up with the same means, it doesn't matter like what great ideas the guy in power has, even if he's like the most benevolent dictator or whatever. There's like 20 guys behind him, like ready to shoot him in the head and like replace him. This is the thing about like, we've never really had real socialism. It's like, even if you were the guy in charge and all your superior understanding of Marxism would lead to the utopia, what makes you think that like you wouldn't immediately be killed and like replaced by the like next guy?
At least, yeah, okay. At least in the definition of like socialism or communism, which is like about maximizing state power. There are other things I would be interested in, like if I could speak to Hayek, like talking about other ideas that tend to be associated with the left, like either like left anarchy or like anarcho-syndicalism and stuff like that. The idea of like federations of like workers and worker cooperatives and stuff. He talks a little bit about worker cooperatives, I think, at some point. I don't think he's particularly positive, but yeah, one of the things is as well, like the idea of like state control to a huge degree. I don't know. I mean, maybe the idea of socialism, as you say, like a 50% plus like government involvement in industry or whatever in the lives of people, is something that is probably more popular than like straight up communism at the moment. But when a lot of the things that people talk about today are mainly in like quite specific fields. So no one's really cares about like nationalizing agriculture. Like I think people are generally pretty like content with how cheap and how varied things are in supermarkets.
Ooh.
People place more emphasis on things like education and healthcare, right? When it comes to like nationalized services today.
I mean, here is a thing where a lot of the left is quite fractured, and so certainly right-wing socialists would not advocate for like any. But if we look at left-wing socialists today,
I'm talking specifically about.
I think one of the biggest issues that has emerged recently is the complete attack on agriculture in the name of climate change. That you have literally like people like holding up signs like abolish agriculture, like no more farming, like literally that's literally a thing. It's just like it's one of the biggest points I would say. But no, I would think if we talk about
I think in just general public discourse, like healthcare and education blow that completely out the water. Like those are
healthcare is a big one in America.
Yes, yeah. And yeah, I mean, there's stuff about some agriculture in Europe, right? But
oh yeah, I mean the Dutch.
Yeah, and Belgium as well recently. But I still think people generally, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe you could argue that's like the next thing after having like good education or whatever.
But again, the nationalized pension system, nationalized healthcare, nationalized all these kinds of insurances, that's one of the big things that Hitler did, right? It's kind of making this point of, National Socialism is socialism. And okay, one more quote, page 21 from Hayek is, many a university teacher in this country during the 1930s has seen English and American students return from the continent uncertain whether they were communists or Nazis, and certain only that they hated Western liberal civilization. I think this is so true today as well. Not necessarily about going to the continent and returning, but sure. In Germany,
liberalism definitely has a bad name today, for sure.
For sure, especially in the universities.
Yeah.
But also this thing of young people flipping between Nazism and communism is extremely true in Germany.
Really?
It's the same group of people that just happen to be on opposite side because their friend was a Nazi or communist first. That's really the only distinction.
That's interesting.
I grew up in a really rough the shittiest school in the district, and I didn't really have any too much contact to outside people, but my friends would have some quite radical acquaintances,
right? Yeah.
And I would always ask oh yeah, I invited fucking Peter, is that cool with you? I was like, the communist? No, he's a Nazi now. And it's well, of course, yeah. It's it's the same idea but different friend group,
It's an interesting idea.
And it's unite the workers against against Western liberalism and so on, right?
You do also see so I follow a lot of I don't know, I watch a lot of debates. I have this sick perversion with political debates.
Yeah.
And it's kind of what's the word? It's self-harm. It's just like watching people shouting at each other. But there is definitely a tendency to and quite an established belief that the people who are Nazis and people who are they're called Nazbols, right? National Bolsheviks. And even just straight up Marxist Leninists, people who are super deep in the Soviet source. They tend to get pretty rightfully compared to Nazis a lot of the time. It's fair enough. It's funny because it's not really horseshoe theory, and I don't know, it's kind of different in a way.
Yeah, and the thing about
horseshoe theory is for anyone who doesn't know, it's just the idea that the more radical there are two sides, left and right, and they inevitably lead to the same position or a similar kind of point, the shape of a horseshoe, and they tend to resemble each other. But I guess the idea is not really the idea that Hayek talks about is not really that they're necessarily so separate, or the things that are different aren't necessarily that important, but the thing is that they both desire this central authority to enact certain goals and certain ideas.
The thing with horseshoe theory is that if you kind of visualize it as a circle or a horseshoe, it would imply that somewhere around the middle horizontal line, there is a point on the right side and the left side where they're the furthest away from each other.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So it implies that there is kind of a point of perfect
opposition.
Opposition.
Yeah.
Which I really don't think exists.
Yeah.
And in my view of things, it's really that left and right are kind of arbitrary distinctions, which have been influenced a lot by history, and I do want to make you read Rothbard at some point, but Rothbard talks about the origin of these kind of ideas.
Yeah.
And according to Rothbard, the term right wing came again back to the French Revolution, where the counter-revolutionaries were sitting on the right side of Parliament.
I see.
That's
sure,
it.
Sure.
That's really it.
And
that at that time, actually, extreme libertarian, laissez-faire people were considered leftists and progressives. So,
and if you spend any time trying to study, even just briefly, like what are the key political issues of any other country aside from the country that you live in, especially a country that's like outside of Europe. Phil, what are you doing? Phil's taking his belt off.
My belt's too tight, man.
I think I said something wrong.
Continue.
So
all this cheese is making me swole.
So in Japan, for example, we both live in Japan, right? And the political issues, yeah, the things that are considered like right wing and left wing here, like then they don't track perfectly to like what are the key political issues back home.
Yeah, I would really say that depending on the place and time you live in,
Mm-hmm.
right and left wing kind of completely contradictory opinions. Like, just look at the last like 10, 20 years in the US. For some reason, the left is now the biggest advocate of big pharma. What the fuck happened?
I don't know if that was true.
No, absolutely. Under the whole, and this is like a complete party politics thing, but like the whole like vaccine thing and like Pfizer, like all the like late shows, they were all rolling out the Pfizer like commercials and like, you know, defending big pharma, like this is the hill we're gonna die on. It was like that degree of like, you know.
I would also not really call like late night TV shows any kind of representation of left wing politics. So they are a representation of something, but I think most like people who are actually committed to left wing, any kind of left wing political philosophy would probably have a lot of things to say.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly
there's definitely a tendency to, I don't know. There's a lot of like we say like mainstream things, like then they are surely like more left than other things, but I think, I mean, I get what you're saying. Like there's maybe like a tendency towards like authority and experts that has like developed in the last maybe 10 years or so.
Right, and just to give some more examples of this, like left-right, like really, flip-flopping. So in Japan, a big leftist point is being anti-nuclear. And we've seen some leftists in Western countries arguing for that as well recently.
Mm-hmm.
But in the height of like the whole climate thing around the early 2000s, you know, pro-nuclear was a big leftist thing of like, let's stop coal and like go nuclear, right?
But the Japanese, so there's something interesting. I don't know. I find that really interesting, the anti-nuclear thing in Japan, like because it also, you know, obviously it's clearly very influenced by like the Fukushima disaster, and maybe even you could argue like the end of World War II. But the critique is like it's regulatory capture in like the energy companies like TEPCO, Tokyo Electricity. Regulatory capture is when businesses, you know, they capture the interest, they essentially collude with the government to create favourable policies and skirt safety protocols and stuff like that. It's described as this like position where companies essentially control what regulations are given to them. So even though this is a big left-wing issue,
but do you think if they fixed that, the left would suddenly embrace nuclear?
Fixed what?
The like safety regulations thing.
I don't know, but my main point is that it's all tied together. And even though it's a big left-wing issue, the criticism is of the state creating a regional monopoly and, you know, negotiating with this one company, right? Then that's considered a left-wing issue.
That is interesting. Yeah, true. Okay.
Anyway, we should move on because this is hour 4.
I hope not. Okay. 2 visions of freedom. Blah blah blah. University teachers. Okay. Right. So yeah, we talk about the point that there's really no democratic socialism. We're in chapter 2.
Fuck me.
Page 23. No, but the beginning is more dense than the middle. So.
Yes, that's true.
So, you know, yeah, Hayek comes out and basically says that, yeah, there's really no, like, the ends that socialism proclaims, there's no way to really achieve them democratically.
Mm-hmm.
and this is really a practical problem that like if you want to have like certain ends which all of society is supposed to be aimed at, like really the only way to do that is to like silence all dissidents, right? You can't possibly get everyone in the country to agree on like the one thing to do in a democratic way.
The question is like, could this not also apply to like liberalism as well? Because so Hayek talks about like the use of propaganda and things like that, right, as a means of the flaws with democracy he talks about, where it's what is it, dictatorship of the majority or whatever the concept is, where as long as you have 51% of people who want something, the rest of the 49% will just have to suck it up and deal with it. And some of the vulnerabilities of democracy being that people who don't have necessarily information to make the best decision for what they consider like the whole country or their society will, decide, I want this kind of policy, I want that kind of policy, I want to vote for this kind of person. And those things can be very easily like manipulated. So, it's like the thing like, we'll give you everything you want, we'll, give you all free healthcare, or we'll build a church in every single city around the country, or whatever appeals to people. But I guess also beyond that, like trying to inculcate like a certain deference to an ideology, whether it's like we want everyone to have exactly the same resources, we want perfect equity throughout society, or I don't know. Don't you think that you can do the same thing for liberalism as well?
The same thing being what?
The same thing as in being like, let's promote this ideology of liberalism, of like perfect, market freedom and individualism and promotion of competition. Those, I mean, you could argue that they're coercive in the same way, right?
Well, they're going to be coercive to some degree, but I think like the criticism still stands. I think that the liberalism which Hayek proposes, which I am by the way not in favor of, can be achieved by democratic means, whereas socialism cannot. Because liberalism allows for a certain plurality of ends to be pursued by many individuals, whereas collectivism or socialism would have the whole society aiming at particular ends, which are not going to benefit like all of those people, right? It's going to benefit certain groups, and like if you don't agree with that, you're just going to have to suck it up.
But then agreeing to a certain set of principles and having them benefit you are two different things, right? Because you get people who are like, this is like the people criticize leftists that have loads of money, and the response to that is, I have loads of money and I pay loads of tax, right? So I still agree with the principles within this like thing that I'm striving for, but so there's not necessarily like a contradiction there, right? It's like,
I struggle to see where you're getting at.
So my point is that like you can be you might not necessarily be acting in your individual like interest when you are voting for a specific policy.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you don't see value in that, or that you don't see that. It doesn't mean that you can't see that as like a rational thing to do or as a beneficial thing to do. So if I was like a millionaire, but I still believed in, principles of like equity, I could vote for, policies that would technically harm me by imposing higher taxes on me, because I believe in this principle of equity, right?
But if you really, you could just give your money away instead of voting for something.
I could do both. I could do either.
Sure. But then by definition, you wouldn't be a millionaire anymore.
So, I mean, maybe I could still have income.
Right, but how is this related to the claim that democratic socialism cannot function?
Because isn't the claim that like having, what is the claim? The claim is that it's like irreconcilable to act as part of like a collective, right?
It's like the means necessary to achieve socialist ends are, like, by definition, contradictory to the means of democracy. You can't have everyone, like, working towards the same goal. Like, you would have to make everyone forcibly do something that they're not actually interested in doing.
But if they happen to be interested in doing the same thing...
Okay, we could conceive of this scenario, but, like, that would mean that you have, like, a country of, a couple million people who just happen to be interested in furthering the goal of one particular group.
But even in the case of, like... even in the case of, like, a situation where there's, like, a majority of people who believe that, people who earn lots of money should be taxed loads of money, a huge percentage, even if there are people that disagree with that, then you would still have, like, a representative of different ideas, but then one trumping the others, right?
Yes.
So I don't...
Which, by the way, Hayek agrees with progressive taxation.
Yeah, no, sure. But, this is an easy example, I guess, right?
I still don't understand what the point you're trying to make.
I don't know, like, I just don't quite get that. I don't quite get how, like...
What do you not get?
How does... I still don't really understand how democratic socialism is, like, a contradiction. Like, working towards one goal is what any government will do, right? After deciding on a vote for something. Premise
for socialism is that, okay, we're going to have to control the means of production. So what happens, like, now we can assume a hypothetical scenario where all the people who own the means of production are like, yeah, sure, just take my stuff, go with it. We can conceive of this scenario, but we're going to dispense with it for the sake of realism.
Okay.
So, realistically, most people who own the means of production are not going to be happy that you're trying to take them by force.
Yeah.
So, like, at this point, like, we cannot democratically control all the means of production. We're going to have to employ totalitarian force to get them.
Possibly, but we could... there are different ways of going around that. Like, you could, for example, like... if a business... You could enact a policy which decided that if a company went out of business, the state could buy it, and that could be owned by the state now, and blah, 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 blah. Or the state itself could, like, try and erect its own businesses. Which would be, like... Which would not be... I'm taking shit from you coercively, but would still forward this goal of, like, high state control in specific industries. Even, the whole idea of the public option, right? It's not necessarily like...
What will happen is, unless the state gives particularly monopolist protection to their own enterprise, the state-run business will go out of business immediately in free market competition, because the state cannot run a business as effectively as a free market can.
But I guess
It's kind of a free market axiom that we're just going to have to work with in economics.
Okay. But I guess, even then,
for example, the railway thing or, like, the post office thing, right? Like, the state can own that as long as it prohibits anyone else from having that kind of business, right? As soon as it allows the free market to also have that kind of business and compete with it, it's going to be a real quick competition.
Well, there are other means as well, like owning property that private companies use, for example. Like, talking about railways, owning the railways and having private companies cooperatively use them, with some government.
And Hayek would allow for that in his vision of liberalism, right? Which is why it's not libertarianism.
Yeah, sure. But I guess in my mind, like, this still allows some kind of democracy to exist, whilst permitting, state ownership of things and some state direction of resources.
Yeah. But again, that would be state ownership of some limited things, like railway companies and things. Like, to the degree that you would have the whole economy directed towards some specific goal, like, you can't do that democratically. Is his claim. It's not that the claim is not that you can't have state ownership without killing democracy.
It's that you can't have one goal of a state without.
Yeah, or like with 2 or 3 that everyone like works towards to democratically decide that. And part of that, and we're going to get into that on the economic side, is that once you take away the mechanism of price, there's no information on how much demand and your quantity demand for something is. So that the planners are like, even if they're super fucking smart, they're basically grasping at straws, right? So
sure.
Okay. Anyway,
let's move on.
Okay, so on this point that socialists often define themselves simply by espousing utopian ends without giving thought to the means necessary to achieve them, central planning. And then Hayek says, those who reject the socialist means are characterized as against the ends. So I think this is a big point.
Say that again?
Those who rejected the socialist means, central planning, are characterized as against the ends.
Okay.
This is not his word, this is my notes. But so, that is to say, like, this is where we have this division today that, like sometimes I've debated Marxists where it's like, well, wouldn't it be great if we all had like the freedom to like do the things that we want and shit, and we agree on that. But then it's like, but liberals would reject the means of state control, and so, then the socialists say like, oh, so the liberals are against socialist ends, or are against freedom, or are against like democracy or whatever, right?
Well, this cuts like to the heart of like any kind of like any like idea of ideologically wanting to involve the state in something, because if you. And I don't know. I mean, you tend to see this more like the theory seems to be more kind of like fleshed out with like Marxism and stuff like that. But like these principles of like this is how this thing is done. Like we do this through these means. The idea of like anarchy, for example. So one thing that I find one question that I haven't really been able to answer is like the idea of this one like strand of like left anarchy is like we will achieve that through communism. So what needs to happen first is a full like communist revolution by whatever means. It could be like through proletarian and probably proletarian like uprising, right? And then once everyone owns the means of production, once the common what's the word?
State.
Well, it would be the state is everyone, right? That would be the ideal, right? It would be shared means of production, public means of production. At that point, but at that point we're already like living in a fantasy land. No. So I'm just putting this in course. The idea that like from that point onwards, all of the like ills of capitalism would fade away, and suddenly everyone would feel like nice towards each other, and then the state would wither away. Blah 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 blah. Is it like Lenin that says that, right? And so there would be no need for the state, and then we would have anarchy, this like left anarchy where we don't have like any kind of like economic coercion or anything like that. It's all just like we've gotten rid of the private property and whatever, and now everyone's just like chill and like happy with each other, and no one wants to like own anything, and like everyone's just like fine. And that like it's so essential, like this idea of like the state will wither away. It's like why will it wither away? Like
well, also, what happens if someone wants to own something? What happens then? You're just gonna kill them?
That would be a question for after. But the main, I mean, before that, you have the question of like why does the state necessarily wither away? And I don't know. Like, I haven't really found an answer to that.
I don't think there is one. I think it's sleight of hand. And okay, I'm gonna have to take a leak, but on this like notion of like if only the capitalist influence will disappear and so on, like. If you want to even take a look at like a micro perspective of like a very slight degree of like more socialist and more capitalist oriented policies. Go to California and go to Louisiana and see where the people are nicer. And with that, I'm going to pee.
Time for a break.
Boys. Book boys.
And with that commentary opening of cheese,
Cheese boys.
we are returning. Okay.
This cheese is warm.
Wait, it's been out in the fucking hot.
So soft.
It's good.
It's fine. It's just unexpected.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know how many kulaks died making this cheese? Cancelled. Okay. One thing we're gonna have to talk about is planning. So, how does Hayek define planning? When he talks about planning, and this is quite central because by planning he means socialism. By planning he means the central direction of economic activity and conscious direction of resources to serve particular ends. He's not talking about whether foresight and systematic thinking should be employed in planning or common affairs, but whether the government makes conditions optimal so that individuals can plan for themselves, or the government plans instead of them.
I can't believe we're only at this point.
I know.
So, yeah.
Page 26.
To sum that up, like, planning is... There's two ideas. One is this idea of planning that... it's like taking, what resources we have, like, we'll put them here, we'll put them here, we'll put them here. We won't use the price mechanism,
he says using foresight and systematic thinking, right?
Yeah.
To plan the public affairs.
Yes.
That's fine.
That can be as deep as you want to go with it. But his kind of like definition of what planning would be in like the ideal liberal state would be more in terms of like creating the environment for which competition can flourish, right?
Mm.
And again, this idea of competition between, everyone who wants to get involved.
Yeah, so he talked about like good planning and bad planning.
Yeah.
Good planning is the use of foresight and systematic thinking and like planning out your individual goals. And then bad planning would be, again, like the conscious direction of economic activity by central authority to achieve particular ends.
Mm.
And so if you wanted, and since like in his view planning is socialism, like again, if you wanted to, like what does he mean by socialism? That's what he means by socialism, right?
Yeah.
Getting another beer, good idea. Okay, right, and he also talks about this idea of central directed economic activity has really been understood as planning.
Yes.
In the literature as well. Okay, another point, and this is where he does kind of lose me. Well, no, I disagree with him on this point, but I think he makes still a very coherent argument, which is that his liberalism is not dogmatic laissez-faire.
Yeah.
So laissez-faire, right, from French, like, don't leave things as they are, he says. Use government to create a legal framework which consciously encourages competition. Quote, where it is impossible to create the conditions necessary to make competition effective, we must resort to other methods of guiding economic activity.
Yeah.
So yeah, he even makes room for like quote unquote bad planning.
Yeah.
In cases where competition fails. But he's very clear in emphasizing that this is only to be done if competition fails, right? It's like planning should never try to supplant competition.
Yeah.
Right?
So one example, if I'm reading you correctly, is he talks about electricity, like the implementation of electricity. And he even like softly advocates for a government mandated monopoly insofar as it would make electricity as like a, as a source of energy cheaper for everyone, as opposed to like gas and coal or whatever. So, insofar as you can, I mean, this is like what people kind of like idealize about the state, right? Like making the state is very good at like organizing things into one specific direction. It can do that. Like, I'm sure you would disagree in many ways, but if we think about like education, for example, this thing which is like just created by the state, which has this full power behind it, and obviously, you know, when education was first introduced, like it was like fiercely criticized, or not criticized, even worse than that, fiercely.
By education, you mean
against
like
public education,
mandatory, yeah.
Mandatory education for children
Mm.
was fiercely, rallied against by, you know, families whose children were like essential for their survival, or essential for them, you know, working on farms or going to the mines and doing labor for them and whatever.
Mm.
But in spite of that, you know, there was, I mean, obviously an increase in like things like literacy, and the idea that like, these things can have benefits for that nation in the long run, right? It's a kind of investment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I want to dig really deep into this point if we read Rothbard someday. And I have lots to say about education, or mandatory education. I think one interesting thing is also that, like, depending on like the country and setting you are, you know, different groups will defend mandatory public education for their own like reasons. So we have, for example, John Stuart Mill, a big like English liberal, fighting for public education. And in his the way he would put it is the right to get educated. Whereas if you look at the history of public education in the United States, I forgot which state it was, but somewhere in the South, when they basically tried to change the law so that you would have like private alternative education. The big like group that rallied against private education and for public education was the Klan, because they wanted the government to indoctrinate children into like their racist views, right?
Right. Okay.
So, yeah, I think public education is kind of a double-edged sword. Not to like dig too deep into it here, but yeah, yeah, just to say that, yeah, okay. So let's give a brief summary of Hayek's liberalism then. So, it's not dogmatic laissez-faire. It is, however, no restrictions on prices or types of goods, quantities, etc. So no price ceilings and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The entry into trades must be open to all on equal terms. Government must not tolerate attempts to individuals or groups to change this. Same for prices, no cartels, no monopolies, price controls. So yeah, Hayek does, like in his view, the state should intervene when monopolies naturally form.
Yeah.
Restricting methods of production may be compatible with preserving competition. Restricting working hours, demanding sanitary standards, prohibiting poisons, etc., even if this increases production costs, you know, can be mandated by the state without hurting competition per se. Okay, he does account for one problem here, which is the social cost of the restriction greater or not, right? So, and this is kind of a big issue I have with his liberalism, where the road to serfdom is like a tad bit open. Is that, you know, he's like, we can have so no price controls, none of this stuff, but the state can have all these special instances where it can basically intervene on quote unquote behalf of the public and infringe on the rights of property of private owners, right? And then he says, okay, so the question here is the social cost of the intervention greater than the social cost of not having the intervention? And this is, I think, a big contradiction, because we're going to get to his rule of law thing. But his big point on the rule of law is that it has to be in a predefined, foreseeable way. Not judging things on their merits, because that's arbitrary power. Okay, so how is this not arbitrary power?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So,
So the whole idea of the rule of law is that, as he describes it, it's like you're supposed to be able to predict the way that the state will act, and that's like one of the ways that you can form actual trust. And when the state starts acting arbitrarily, that's when trust is trust is weakened, and this whole kind of like idea crumbles.
yeah.
I would. It's hard to say, but in the case of something like a monopoly, which is quite easy to understand, and you could put like a specific number, like a percentage of the market share, which would constitute a monopoly, and I'm sure there actually already is one. To the extent that you could incorporate that into the rule of law, right? One of the most important things he talks about is like you should be able to predict what the state will do, and like having a state that has no accountability is where like tyranny comes from, right? A state which doesn't have to explain its own behavior. But I don't see why you couldn't. This is a monopoly. We know that the state will intervene at when this kind of thing occurs.
Right. Well, the monopoly thing is, again, I think he gives us two foundational principles, which really makes his like thinking original from any other economist, which is that the one is the rule of law as he defines it, and the other one is the principle of competition, right?
Yeah.
So intervention is okay as long as it fosters competition and doesn't curb competition. The monopoly thing, I don't think is a thing of the rule of law. It's more of a competition thing, right?
Okay, sure.
But yeah, again, the point I was making is that like with all these interventions that he like accounts for of like restricting working hours and demanding certain sanitary standards, is like, but who decides like whether the social cost is greater than having the restriction or not? Because obviously, even in like a perfect democracy, you're going to have interest groups lobbying so that they don't bear the cost of this like intervention, right?
Right. Okay.
Right. So like of course, like Hayek is not going to like deliver us the utopia in this book, but I think this is a big point of contention, which he also acknowledges, right? That this is like a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Social services are also okay, like healthcare and so on.
Yeah.
And he makes a claim, which is that money and markets and information channels, as well as legal systems that specifically foster competition, cannot be provided by private institutions. Not sufficient to recognize private property and freedom of... Okay, I'm rereading my notes, that's why it's like choppy. Right, so it's not just sufficient to recognize the right of private property and the freedom of contract, which is the libertarian point of view.
Yeah.
But that you also have to have actually government institutions like a monopoly on money and, channels of information, markets, and so on. So libertarians would argue against a government-controlled money, whereas Hayek would argue for a government-controlled money. And he doesn't really argue for it, he just claims it.
Kind of leaves it open.
Okay. So yeah, right, reading this, I was like, alright, I see your point. Very reasonable. I don't agree, but this is probably like the most reasonable, like centrist view you would get.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And then, so he brings up this thing of like supply of traffic signs or roads, right?
Yeah.
Restrictions on noise, restrictions on pollution cannot be managed by the price competition system. They need to be regulated by authority. So Nick, in Japan right now where we're living, noise complaints, right, where you're living. Like, we're screaming in this room right now. I should probably close the window, actually. I just remembered that.
Please don't.
Okay, but...
like a dog in a hot car.
What happens if we are in this room screaming about liberalism very loudly, and then someone puts in a noise complaint? What actually happens? Does the government step in?
They don't.
They don't, exactly. The person goes to the Kanrigaisha, the management company. So like this whole issue of like noise complaints and stuff, like that's already completely solved by the private market in the current society that we live in. And I would and like if we get to Rothbard, we'll talk about all the other things as well.
Sure, but to the extent that the people who are okay, yeah, this is a really really good like topic to talk about.
Like it's really like a supply and demand thing, right? If there is a demand for being like having peace in your own home, there's going to be a private institution which supplies a certain guarantee of having quiet in your own fucking home, right? So like he doesn't really dig into this. He just kind of glosses over this, and I think he doesn't want to antagonize a like great readership by like being super like radical. And actually, he isn't very radical libertarian, but yeah, I think a lot of these things that he kind of glances over here, not only can they be solved by the market, but they actually are solved by the market in the society that we live in.
Insofar as the consumer themselves or the individual is aware of what the problem is and where it comes from. If we're talking about a noise complaint, that's simple enough because it's not necessarily simple enough because you might think it's your neighbor, but it could be the person upstairs, and it's not always clear like from your perspective as an individual where this problem comes from. And you may misattribute it to something else.
But whether the intervening body is the management company of your building or the government, like that's not gonna... Like if you complain to the government instead of the management company, that wouldn't like solve the issue of you not knowing who made the noise.
Okay, fair enough. The main point that I wanted to make is that there's this like this how do you say, like range or like levels of knowledge about certain things, right? One of the reasons that like we have ministries today is so we can have government officials who have specific knowledge about certain industries which ordinary people don't have, right? So we have like the Ministry of like Agriculture, right? And the people in the Ministry of Agriculture, they technically answer to the government, but the reason that they're there is to have very specific knowledge about the agricultural industry, which without them would only be held by the agricultural industry.
Well, I would say that I can't speak about every country, but like if I think about my own country, you have like random politicians who really have no expertise in the field at all, who just got voted in. Now they're thrown into this ministry. And effectively, the knowledge doesn't come from the politician, it comes from the agricultural lobby. So they talk to lobbyists, the lobbyists supply them with their information, and then the politicians do like what they're appointed to do.
Okay, but I don't think that necessarily applies to everything. The ideal of a ministry is not to be controlled by a lobby. The reason that you have a ministry is so you are not controlled by a lobby.
They're not controlled, but that's where they would get their expertise from.
Well, even in that case, it would run antithetical to a ministry to get your information purely from the industry itself.
Fair enough. They do their own studies and whatever, right?
Yeah. And the reason for that is to safeguard against this control from lobbies or from companies themselves. Right? There is supposed to be a counterbalance when it comes to creating policy that a ministry or the government, to say the state, will have knowledge which will prevent them from being controlled. To talk about like Fukushima, for example, like one of the reasons that Fukushima happened was because the state had no fucking clue what the industry was telling them it was okay to do, right? And so safety protocol was relaxed massively, and you can criticize. I mean, the thing is, it's like. It'll be interesting in hearing what I have to say, like, because a libertarian would say that like, there's no need for any intervening body, any state to kind of regulate these things, and it would be in the rational interest of the company to provide a service to the customer, right, and not have like a nuclear meltdown that would like destroy trust in nuclear energy, right?
When it comes to those issues, the libertarian position, according to Rothbard and kind of those circles, would be that you would have regional courts who do like make regulations, but those courts are run by private companies. They're not run by the government.
Yeah. But why? How
so
would
there
that
still be regulatory bodies, but they're privately run.
But how would that protect against anything? Like, what? How would that protect from the same thing, this exact same thing happening?
Well, why wouldn't they?
Well, how would the court have the same information that the business does? What would prevent the
Well,
business from capturing the court?
Well, you can't guarantee like 100% that if the courts were privately run, there would not be a nuclear meltdown, right? There's no such guarantee.
That's not what I'm saying.
Right? No. But the idea is that like over like historical precedent, if the court company is so shit that the people are so unsatisfied with the way they run things, you know, they would like get a different court company to run things.
But the thing is, how do people know whether the court is doing a good job or not? Because the average person has no idea. Like,
I would disagree with that.
The average person has no idea how to run a nuclear like energy factory, right?
Well, but if there's like a historical precedent of like this company is just like generally shit at doing things, then you know they would probably get like not hire that, like be interested in paying that company anymore. Whereas like, you know, again on this like specific nuclear example, there's no guarantee that there's not going to be a meltdown, right?
Sure.
But yeah, the idea is that at least like compared to the state system, there would be more accountability, because in the state system there's really there's no alternative, there's no competition, there's no alternative, because like, you know, people in court, they're not voted in, they're not politicians, they're appointed bureaucrats for life. So like, if they're in, and they can just basically do what they want, and if they do their job shitty, they're probably going to get away with it, and they're not going to be like personally responsible. Whereas in the company, there's going to be much more pressure from stockholders and like from also competition to do things properly. So is there a guarantee that things won't go wrong? No, but the argument is simply that compared to the state system, there's more pressure from stockholders and from other competing companies that they would do things better than the state. Right?
Sure. I see what your argument is. Yeah. I think that was a nice little tangent.
Okay. So Hayek says, in no system that could be rationally defended would the state just do nothing. I'd cry my crocodile tears. So yeah, like Hayek is not an anarchist, and really he is like from what we can gain, Hayek is a utilitarian. He is not a natural rights libertarian.
Yeah, sure.
And so Rothbard would say, you know, if you're not a natural rights libertarian, you're not a libertarian at all. And obviously Hayek is not pretending to be one, but
yeah,
Hayek is not necessarily concerned on like a moral sense of what is right and wrong in sense of policy, but more what will yield the best outcomes.
Yes.
So in that sense, I think it's very fair to call him a utilitarian.
Yeah, that's a fair point. He's definitely willing to compromise quite a lot.
Okay, right. He says there can be no competition in socialism. It is impossible to assume control over all the productive resources without also deciding for whom and by whom they are to be used. We get into this whom question later as well.
Yeah.
Right. He says left and right socialists are united in opposing competition, but agree on little else, necessary first results. Right, okay, so again, with this like left-right socialism thing, so the first common denominator is they agree that competition is bad. And then, but there are still like disagreements about the particular ends that should be served. The means are the same, but the ends are slightly different, or completely different even. Okay, what is the first result of this? A syndicalist organization of industry,
yes,
where the consumer is at the mercy of monopolists and the worker co-ops.
So this This is what I wanted to talk about, syndicalism.
And this is, I mean, I don't know the definitions here, but this sounds to me just like mercantilism, which Adam Smith fought against. So basically, yeah, you have government giving certain industries, certain companies, certain interest groups a like monopolist protected position, and so they can like run their industry, safeguarded from competition.
Like the East India Trading Company is one very famous example.
Absolutely. Or what is the one that makes the airplanes? Airbus?
Airbus. Is it called Airbus?
I think it is.
Boeing.
Boeing.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And so what does it mean that the consumer is at the mercy of monopolists in the workflow? It means that basically the consumer pays a higher price than they would otherwise.
Yes.
So if it's just Boeing, it's not the end of the world.
Cue the 30-minute tangent about Japanese agriculture.
No, I'm not going to get into that, but right. I would just continue my points.
No, keep going. This is good.
Okay. So another point is, we are, by the way, where are we? In chapter... Oh God, don't ask me.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 4 is where we are.
We've gone back.
So, Marxism claims, as technology advances, advantage of large firms trumps that of small firms, monopoly is inevitable.
Yeah, right.
So Hayek rejects this.
Yeah.
And I think so with the historical precedent.
Yeah.
Right. He says economies of scale don't necessitate monopolies, which are usually obtained through public policy. Again, Boeing, right? It's a good example of that. Or even like, the railway companies in Japan, where it's like, yes, they're privately owned, but also there's like a fucking dictionary of regulations, which like makes it pretty much like practically impossible for there to be any competition at all.
Right.
And like the state owns a big share and so on. Okay.
Yeah.
Technical experts. Oh yes. Okay. This is a really good point. So experts, especially like scientists and so on, are biased towards planning because their field-specific aims could be achieved if resources from all the fields were withdrawn and poured into their field, right?
Say that again.
Like, so it's like, why are experts, why are scientists, why are engineers and so on, why are they biased towards planning? Is because, they're obviously hyper-focused on their specific field, be it medicine, engineering, whatever. And so in their mind, like, if their field had more resources, they could do all these amazing things that they were trained their whole life to do, right? But, they obviously don't care about, like, in order to do that, they would have to draw away resources from other experts.
And this was he gave the Autobahn as an example, right?
Yes.
Which was, so like, a technical triumph, like this incredible, like, feat of engineering, which was maybe kind of completely inappropriate given the fact that there were many other problems that needed solving.
Right. So like nowadays, you still have like neo-Nazis in Germany saying, "Oh, but we got the Autobahn from Hitler," and it's
such a fucking shit argument.
I know, and like, yeah, Hayek would say, yeah, and the Autobahn, by the way, is just an example of a misdirection of resources.
Yeah.
And he says guns instead of butter, right? So people are starving literally. And we're building this fucking huge structure.
Yes.
And by the way, if you drive on the Autobahn today in Germany, it's awful because the roads are a complete mess. It's always congested.
It's just all solar panels now. You have to drive on solar panels.
No, there's just so much congestion. Like you can't move.
Environmental activists glued to the road everywhere.
Also that. No, but I think this point of also that, honestly, but like he makes a very good observation that like, and we go back to this later where he says that natural scientists are more biased towards planning than humanities and social scientists.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, that it's like all these people who are hyper specific, like focus on their thing
and have absolutely no training in political philosophy.
Right, and like they, and it's not necessarily that they're bad people, right?
Yeah.
They like generally believe if they had more resources, they can do all these great things, but they don't consider that there's like an infinitum of other fields.
Yes,
and maybe the whole social cost of doing their thing is actually not worth it.
Yeah.
And obviously, don't roll your eyes. The most recent example of this is Anthony Fauci, right? Where we have this guy coming out being like, I am the science. If you, like, coming literally out to Parliament being, if you criticize me, you criticize science itself, which is what he said. And, like...
That stands with the ideals of science, definitely.
Well, exactly. It's like, why should we shut down the whole economy? Why should we withdraw all these massive resources to do this one thing that happens to be your thing, which is like vaccinations or whatever? It's like, yeah, obviously you're an expert in that and you believe in that and it's probably good, but it doesn't mean that all other economic goals should be subverted to your thing, right?
Some kind of moderation or some kind of I get what you're saying.
And it's like, all this, like, also renewable energy, like Bjorn Lomborg talks about opportunity cost a lot, and like how we can spend money effectively. And like, yes, like it makes sense to invest in renewable energy so we can innovate down the price of it so it can be like commercially viable. That's great. But also the same dollar could be spent in like a billion other ways which would get much greater return for society, right?
The thing, I mean, Hayek, I think he would probably be kind of ambivalent towards that. Like I don't know if he would have like a hard, fast answer for these though. Because he's already admitted that like he would be happy creating monopolies to, make electricity cheaper for people.
No, he wouldn't say happy to create monopolies. He would say that if competition fails in a certain area, like, yes, the state should supply that, right? And like, he really doesn't get into this, which is hard to judge it. He just kind of assumes that the market couldn't supply it.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah,
as a libertarian, you would fiercely argue against that.
No, but the point that he's making is that if the market can supply it, the market should supply it. It's only if it cannot supply it, then we should have state thing, right?
I mean, yeah, we could talk about for ages where that line would be.
Yeah, and that's kind of a problem with his philosophy, I would say. Okay, so chapter 5. We're moving on. We're 1/3 into it.
5 out of 16, baby.
So I wrote down Smith quote, page 42. Let's make you read this. I've been reading all my fucking shittily scribbled down notes, which I can't read myself. Okay, read that.
Where?
Smith quote.
The statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted to no council and senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it.
This is, in like a roundabout way, gets at the later point that Hayek makes about why there is really no good totalitarianism, which I guess we're going to have a debate about that. But we'll get to that. Calm down.
Yeah.
I know you want. If you were the one, now.
What? Fuck you.
And we would all look like minions with the round glasses, like cute striped shirt. Okay, this is.
I'm goth minion today.
No, but like, yeah, like. Again, like the person who would be like so foolish as to think that he can like direct the whole economy to do like things better than all the private actors in the economy, that he would have a more complete knowledge than the price system itself. Like that's probably the worst person. Like if you have to give that job to any person, which you shouldn't, that's probably the worst person.
The worst person is like, oh yeah, I got it.
I got it.
I know. You're like, oh.
Yeah, which I think is also an inherent problem with democracy, is that like often the people who rise to power are like, like the way that the incentives are set up is like you get like some of the worst people because all the good people are like, well, I don't know how to like direct everyone's fucking life.
Yeah. Like, people who are too self-critical will never rise to that kind of level.
Yeah. So like in order to like have the attitude that you know how to like tell everyone what to do, you're probably not the greatest guy.
yeah.
Okay. So what else? We got individualism is not based on selfishness, but on the simple fact that individuals cannot possibly know the values of everyone else, and each person should therefore follow his own values. Right. Okay. I think this comes in really in Japan as well. If you say kojin-shugi, individualism in Japan, people are like immediately, oh, you mean like selfishness?
Right.
Or like even the word jiu, freedom. Like, when someone just does whatever they want and like disregards societal norms.
Yeah.
And like is selfish in a way that's like offensive almost.
Yeah.
People here say, jiu da na. Like,
it's like, oh, you had 7 whole days of holiday.
Yeah. It's like,
you fucking like.
What an individualist! What a free soul!
Yeah.
And it's
so
like
Americanized.
Yeah, and Hayek makes sure that no, this is not what he means by individualism. It's not selfishness, but it is simply that you don't lie to yourself about knowing what everyone else wants, right? It's that I can't possibly know what you want or how you should achieve it, so I'm just gonna leave you the fuck alone to do whatever you want to do. Right? And this is also, if we want to talk about Japan, the Natsumi Soseki thing in Watashi no Kojin Shugi, my individualism.
Right.
Okay, democracy only possible in capitalism. Another claim.
Yes.
Theoretically, I would have to think about it, but I guess the historical record speaks to that. I can't really think of any other system where there was democracy without capitalism.
I mean, maybe, definitely not representative democracy. I don't know. I mean, even just like, well, like I say, quote primitive, like, communities that weren't necessarily like, couldn't necessarily be qualified by like a specific economic like structure, like capitalism or.
If you want to talk about like villages, right?
Yeah. Where direct democracy is maybe practiced more, and private property is maybe a little bit less kind of clearly established, and trade is maybe not as stronger theme. But yeah.
Okay, chapter 6. Okay, finally, the rule of law.
Oh god, I'm actually having to fucking scroll up on my notes. It's like
this is one of the. Well, but we are like halfway through my notes.
Yeah. But we're getting there.
So the rule of law, what is it? It's like the second biggest principle that Hayek advocates for besides competition, which he defines, meaning that government operates under fixed rules announced beforehand.
Yeah.
So that it allows individuals to foresee how government will act and plan their affairs accordingly. It excludes the arbitrary use of coercive force by government. The rule of law is different between... What did I write here? Okay, so the difference between a free country and an unfree country, he says, is that there is the rule of law or there isn't. Right?
Yeah. This is like a super fundamental liberal idea.
Yes. And again, like, he doesn't really get into the specifics. And actually, he has like a 3-part book series where he just talks about this.
Really? Wow. I was surprised. Like, this book it contains a lot of ideas, but a lot of them don't go like hugely deep. But they are definitely well condensed.
You can like explore these deeper if you like look at other, like his other writings. Mm-hmm. But I think the purpose of this book was really to be like a more like, I want to talk to the common man about why we should care about liberalism. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So he says the rule of law. So rules should be formal and based on principles, which can be applied for a long period of time. And the opposite of that would be arbitrary laws, which benefit certain groups, specific decisions, etc. So he says that like. Sure, you could say, like, to the degree that Hitler rose to power according to the laws, like, his authority was quote-unquote legal. But he would say that, a law saying Hitler can do whatever he wants That's not the rule of law.
Right.
That's just arbitrary power. What do you think about this principle?
I don't know. I mean, fundamentally, like, I agree with the idea that, like, any law should be clearly like understandable, and that it strikes me as something much more cooperative if people are able to, like, anticipate how their actions will be received, and not be. I mean, obviously, you want to reduce, like, arbitrary abuse of power wherever you can, right? Like, you don't want to find yourself in some, like, Kafkaesque trial situation where you're being, like, persecuted for something that you don't even fully understand. Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty fundamental.
Yeah, like, I don't really have any disagreements with this, except that, like, it's not super well defined in this book.
Yeah, there's one thing he says which is quite interesting. Is he says, like, the rule of, this is not a quote, but
yeah,
essentially that the rule of law produces inequality, but not in any specific way for any specific person, and not in an intentional way, which is quite an important distinction, I think, because the arbitrary abuse of power would be to produce inequality intentionally, right?
Right. Well,
for a specific person, right?
I would say that his choice of words is really unfortunate here, and I think what he means to say is really that the rule of law does not try to stamp out the necessary inequality that arises from the scarcity of nature and the different abilities and talents that people are born with, right?
Sure.
So obviously, like, not everyone is born equally in terms of even, like, physical features like height, IQ, like, whatever, like, wealth or poverty they're born into. So the rule of law doesn't try to stamp that out artificially. So I think that's what he means by it creates inequality, quote unquote.
Yeah, but I think, I don't know, I think it's quite an honest way of talking about it, really, because it points to the fact that, like, the economic reality of things is that you have to have, well, his kind of assertion is that you have to have, like, there's no ideal utopian scenario where there's no inequality. Yeah, it is produced through the systems that we apply, but he believes that this is the one that works the best. Have you heard of the Southern Strategy?
No.
So it was like a
Is it a chess move?
No. I'm not super familiar with it, but I came across it when I was, like, researching, and it was, I don't know, maybe something, I think this is probably going to trigger you, but it was kind of like a political strategy in, like, the 1970s or something, or maybe earlier in the 1950s maybe, to where the American conservatives attempted to get conservative votes through, like, liberal ideals of, like, you know, no, like, affirmative action or no, like, preferable treatment to, like, minorities. We'll go back to these, like, fundamental, like, equal fair values of, like, you know, no one's being targeted specifically for, like, in regards to the rule of law.
Which is what probably they still stand today, right?
Sure, but there's a quote by this this campaign consultant called Lee Atwater, who was talking about, like, how Republicans can win, and he said, you start out in 95 by saying, quote, N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this. It's much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word.
I don't even know what he's trying to get at. But...
Well, what he's saying is that, like, if you are, like, deeply racist and your, like, ambition is to hurt, like, black people, for example, this guy's solution was basically saying, like, by couching our political ideology in like this like more abstract like idea of like fairness, like free states' rights and stuff like that, we know that in our state this will hurt black people and they'll want to go somewhere else.
Of course, this contradicts the empirical reality, but go on.
I mean, this guy seemed to believe it, so
sure. I mean, there are plenty of guys who believe plenty of things.
But I mean, I think this is interesting, like, and this is kind of the thing, like, I guess general like skepticism towards everything, but like the liberal like swallowing the liberal pill and being like, oh, this perfect ideology of like, you know, perfect individualism and freedom and whatever, and it's like, it's also worth like strongly considering under what kind of circumstances these ideas are being, like these ideas are appearing to you, and like why.
So you're talking that there is a possibility of people with bad intentions misusing liberal ideas to get what they want.
Yes. Yeah.
I would discount that on the grounds that if the liberal ideas are really functional, it doesn't really matter what intentions you're using them with, they will produce the same results, which are worth aspiring. And if they don't produce the results, which the original liberals would purport they do, then they're not worth pursuing in the first place, no matter what your intentions are.
Fair enough.
I guess the same would also go for the other side, right? You have, like, if you look at LBJ and, like, affirmative action and all that stuff, like, why was that put into place? Oh, LBJ was working with the KKK. Oh, he was saying N-word all the time behind closed doors. Like, he was saying, we'll have these N-words voting Democrat for years, like, because of affirmative action. Like,
right.
So, like, that's definitely a double-edged sword, right? But no, it's a good point. Like, yeah. Yeah, okay. Moving on to chapter 6. Unless you want to do the same thing.
We're on money now, right?
Okay, so no, we're already in chapter 6. Yes, okay. Rule of law, I think, is a very sensible principle. And just closing statement, like, even if you consider, like, any laws in like, new, like, any new law that's being discussed in your parliament right now, or even when it comes to things like company or university policy, I think this is a super useful principle to apply. Does this rule produce foreseeable consequences that allows me to act according to like what I think will happen, or does this rule simply give someone power to decide something quote unquote on its merits?
Right.
And whenever there's like a planning, an organ, like a person in charge or like a board of directors or whatever that decides things quote unquote on its merits, that's bad. That's never good. So yeah, I think super simple principle, not especially elaborate discussed here, but yeah, I think definitely worth considering in any case, not just laws, but also like any kind of policy.
Yeah.
Don't give people arbitrary power if you don't know what they're going to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, chapter 7. Okay, yeah, so there's this illusion that the economy and public life are two different things. But Hayek says, control of the economy is not simply control over a sector which can be differentiated from private life, but it is the control of the means to all our ends, and therefore of the ends themselves. So, there was this like idea, I guess, among like socialists or planners, if you want, that, the economy is one thing and your private life is another thing. And really, if we had the state plan the economy, it could be run much more effectively, and this would create prosperity, and then you can do whatever you want in your private life.
Mm-hmm.
But what Hayek points out is that, or nowadays this would be like leftists saying, you just care about money. Like this is the thing that liberals always, or that libertarians always get. You just care about money. You just care about money.
Mm.
Yeah, but money is the means which decides all the ends of each individual. So if you control quote unquote money, if you control the economy, you don't just control the economy. You control everything. You control all the possible ends, right?
So yeah, the theory, or like the conception of money is it's the ultimate potentiality, because we have trust with money. It's like, I know if I give you that, then if I give you $5, then you do $5 worth of things for me, and we have this like understanding through this like material thing, or this, I don't know, this concept, what it is. And yeah, once that thing itself is controlled by the state, then the state controls freedom, right?
It's like, if any like libertarian advocates for lower taxes, like the usual like leftist positions always, oh, you just want more money, you just want more money. It's like, yeah, but money is like like you want a specific end, for example, climate policy or XYZ policy. The libertarian point is that actually many different people have many different ends, and like not taking their means away simply means that, double meaning of means there, simply means that they can choose to pursue their own ends, right? It's not about money. It's about allowing people to choose their own ends, how to live their life.
Yeah, sure.
And that, like, yeah, even in Hayek's time, this was like a big. He doesn't use this word, but I would say it's kind of a sleight of hand to say that we're just gonna differentiate the economics from the private life or from the ends. But it doesn't work that way, right?
Sure.
Okay. Chapter 8, if you have any points.
Go ahead.
Oh, right, okay, so he mentions that actually wealth distribution in Soviet Russia is less equal than in the United States. And why does he bring this up? To illustrate that the income from property is not as big a player as often claimed when it comes to inequality. So the Marxist point, and like especially fucking iterated in absolute garbage book, which is called The New Capital by Piketty.
Oh, Capital in 21st Century.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, Piketty, Thomas Piketty.
Anyway,
I haven't read it, but
it's not worth it. But
I mean, I know what you'll say.
I mean, no, it's worth reading a summary so you know what it's about.
Yeah.
But it's so long and like.
Well, it is Capital, right? In the 20th.
Yeah,
it's got to be like
yeah.
5,000 pages long.
No, but actually, I would say Marx's Capital is worth reading.
Yeah.
Capital in the 21st Century is not worth reading. Just read the summary. Anyway,
Yeah.
So, like, a big point is that, like, oh yeah, like, the problem is that there's all this income from property, not just your income from your job, right? Like, people own property, they inherit property.
Yes, yeah.
And the reason why the wealth distribution is unequal is because, like, this ownership
Private
of property.
yeah.
And if only we got rid of that, then we would solve inequality. And Hayek is like pointing out that no, it's like in like the fucking Soviet Russia, top 10% own like over 50% of all property, and in the US it's like 35%. So yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. He goes on to say that private property is what guarantees freedom, even to those without property. Big point. By keeping complete control away from the state. So, yeah, a big leftist point, I guess, is to say that, you know, you only argue for private property because you own private property. And the high point is, no, actually, even if you don't own property, a system where there is private property will be better for you than a system where there is no private property.
Sure.
Even if you don't own any property at all. And this kind of brings us into, like, World Economic Forum things. Like, have you seen the thing with the drones? I've seen
some things with drones.
Klaus Schwab, like, World Economic Forum, the last time they met, the, like, big predictions to, like, 2030 or something was, there will be no more private property.
Really?
Yeah, I was like, you won't own anything. Like, everything will be rented, like, delivered to your house by drones.
Right.
Which is kind of a nightmare scenario. But, like, you know, this is just to say that, or even if you, like, look at modern Japan right now, like, even if you don't really own anything, like, we are obviously students in our fucking undergrad students like living in like the cheapest apartment possible, like having like a little side job, earning like minimum wage, but like we don't really own any property.
No.
But we have all these things available, like convenience stores and like all these like good services and like cheap internet, and all these things are available to us simply because there is the institution of private property.
Sure.
So you don't actually have to own private property in order to benefit from it.
Yeah. Well, that is one of the weird things about Japan is like what we typically associate with like the common spaces, public spaces. Like, you'd think of them as like public goods are private.
Yeah.
All the convenience stores, like you can pay your taxes there, you can send mail from there,
you pay your rent, you get
your rent, you can eat, you can like live off one of them in terms of your groceries and everything.
If you need like a certificate for your residence, or like you need like your driver's license translated, it's like all the convenience store does everything. Right?
You can take money out, you can scan stuff, you can print things, you can literally do anything, but they are completely private. So it is kind of interesting. I kind of hate it, but it's also very useful.
I couldn't go back. Yeah.
Okay. Potential plenty is another thing, right?
I didn't write that down, but yeah.
I think that's from the same similar chapter. So he talks a lot about like potential plenty is this like socialist myth, and I think so. The idea of like, I mean, this is something that I also like kind of can't wrap my head around, and a lot of people find it difficult. I think is like, this question of like, in this age where we have so much stuff, like how have we not eradicated poverty? How have we not eradicated like scarcity of certain things? When people see like, like empty homes and stuff like that, when homelessness is also still happening, or like, the university counseling program is like mental health counseling is cut at the same time your professor's like walking out with a brand new MacBook or some shit. Like,
well, I would say two things. One is that in the West we have effectively abdicated absolute poverty. There's only relative poverty now. Like, if you're living in absolute poverty in the West, you are trying really hard to do so. Like you have to be like consciously working towards that goal.
I think I could give it a go.
Like, when it comes to like the world, the like liberal answer would be that world absolute poverty halved between 2000 and 2010.
Yeah. So
that like, as we're speaking about why is there still poverty right now, we're eradicating poverty at an unprecedented rate in history. So we're certainly working towards it. The thing about like potential plenty is that like there's all these stuff, like all these rich people have all this stuff. If we just redistribute it to all the poor people, then everyone would have like so much stuff. The argument that, or the thing that's overlooked in that is that the incentives, which create all that stuff, is that you get to actually own the stuff you produce. Once you eradicate that principle, once you don't get to keep the stuff you make, then like all this plenty will stop being produced, because why the fuck would you make something for someone else?
I see what you're saying. I guess as well, like generally, just the idea of scarcity is not something that like. I find it interesting because like, economics is not like a subject that the left tends to deal with super directly, and but also in a way it's kind of antithetical, because the whole like field of economics is like, how do we distribute these scarce resources that have multiple uses, to quote Thomas Sowell. It's like, it's about allocating resources, and we don't have infinite amounts of them, and that's like the basis from which like economics works from, right?
Right.
And I think a lot of kind of yeah, when people on the left generally talk about like redistribution, it's not under the assumption that there's kind of like an assumption that there's like a con going on, where it's like, yeah, things are being unfairly distributed around,
right?
And
like it actually like kind of shocked me when I read Capital by Marx.
Yeah,
how imbecilic his notion of this is. It's like when he talks about what Adam Smith called the carrying trades. So that's all like basically transportation, trucking, like delivering things from A to B, logistics, all that kind of stuff. Like Marx is super explicit in saying that this is all a scam, right? So like if a guy in some village makes bread, and then he sells the bread in the village for $10, and then some merchant comes along and is like, I'm gonna buy your bread for $7 a piece. I'm gonna deliver it to village B, and I'm gonna sell it to all these people. So you're gonna get a lot more money, even though you're gonna sell the bread cheaper to me.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna sell the bread even a little cheaper to all these other people. And now all these people have bread. You have more money, I have more money, and literally Marx looks at this and he's like, this is a scam. The merchant is evil. The farmer is being exploited. And it's like it's not. Well, I'm not like trying to make him look bad. He's like super explicit and like, how are you this like? He's not a stupid guy, so it's like I don't know. Like you have to be evil to be like that intellectually disingenuous. Like I don't know. Anyway, so that's the whole plenty thing. It's the capitalists say, if you leave people to do their own thing and keep their stuff, they will produce many things. And then the Marxists come in and say, what if we take all those things away and give them to other people? Well, obviously, they won't produce those things anymore. Okay. Okay, another thing that Hayek mentions, chapter 8, is that socialist movements don't typically aim at perfect equality, but simply greater equality. This is the whom question. So who decides what to take from whom to give it to whom, right? Mm-hmm. So to the planner, it's pretty clear that you take from the rich. Yeah. But then what? Who gets the spoils, right? So this is again goes back to why there can't really be this democratic solution, because once you take away things from one guy, like there's going to be like a conflict of how to distribute this stuff to give all the other people, right?
How so?
Like say, okay, we're going to take like the richest 10%, we're just going to take like most of their stuff. Okay, so how are you going to decide who to give it to?
I mean, like income brackets. Like, proportional to how much money you earn, you'll receive a proportional amount of that money that's taken. So if you're really, really poor, then you get a large amount. If you're not very poor, you don't get a very large amount.
Well, that's kind of just, I guess, like welfare state and progressive income tax, right? Like in regards to what Hayek would still allow within his framework of liberalism.
Well, how is that different to what you're talking about?
I mean, like the complete, what do you call it, expropriation? So like a centrally planned socialist economy would have to like have specific goals, and so it's like, are we going to spend this on the military? Are we going to spend this on food, autobahn or butter?
Okay.
Guns or butter. Like it's, I guess in theory, it's not completely impossible how you would solve that democratically, but it just seems so obvious that like certain interest groups would through lobbying or like more specific institutional power would like divert the spoils to themselves.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say.
I mean it's page 82. I don't know
if you give me you just show me the page.
I mean, I guess it starts here if you want to read it out, but I don't really know where it ends.
That a government which undertakes to direct economic activity will have to use its power to realize somebody's ideal of distributive justice is certain. Yeah, okay. But how can and how will it use that power? By what principles will it ought to be guided? Is there a definite answer to the innumerable question of relative merits that will arise, which will have to be resolved deliberately? Is there a scale of values on which reasonable people can be expected to agree, which would justify a new hierarchical order of society and is likely to satisfy the demands for justice? I mean, I don't think that's necessarily antithetical to democracy. If you have many people who are interested in a specific issue, then, money that the state acquires can be, disproportionately put towards that end, right? If you have a bunch of people that want to build, like, wind farms, for example, you take some of that tax and you put it towards that, right? And, I mean, that would actually accommodate a multiplicity of different ideas, right?
Fair enough. And at this point, I guess he's not talking about democracy. I brought that into that, but
even if he was talking about democracy, though, it would allow for that, right?
Yeah, which is why why I don't agree with democracy. But but yeah, he was talking about like this idea of like perfect equity. You could say.
Oh, okay.
It's at least at his time was not really a like socialist goal. It was more like let's be more equal.
Yeah.
So, but then again, the question arises: who gets the spoils? So this is why socialism always works like towards like there's always like a core interest group who gets the stuff, right? Which is an inherent problem. Okay, wait, let me read the next point. Maybe this will connect. Socialist movement prioritizes certain groups. Okay, yes, okay, now we get into it. New socialists turn against the new privileged old socialists.
There's this, isn't there?
Yes. So, he says, fascists simply took over the institutions socialists produced. Quote, it was not the fascists, but the socialists who began to collect... Okay, children. Okay, different point, never mind. But...
yeah, that's a different one.
Oh, fuck, he talks about this somewhere else as well, but he basically says that the first socialist movements kind of created an upper middle class of engineers and university-educated workers who, through, like, labor unions and those kind of institutions, got a better standing in society.
Mm-hmm.
But that created a new underclass, so to speak, right?
He's talking about like this is actually quite central to a lot of his argumentation. It's like allocating resources in certain areas will like take privilege away from other areas.
Yes.
In ways that aren't necessarily like understood or even cared about. We'll get to it at the end, but like he talks about this in terms of like international politics, that was quite interesting. Like his advocation, like he very strongly advocates like basically kind of borderless approach to like organization. He's like, why should we have a state that only favors the people within it and that doesn't favor the people outside it? And
I don't think he advocates for borderless organization, but by saying that, he points out that socialism will inevitably turn to nationalism.
Maybe, yeah.
But yeah, this is the point he picks up later. So yeah, maybe we'll just continue.
He definitely says that it doesn't make sense that the national group should entitle someone to shares over people who don't live there.
Yes.
Indoctrination. He talks quite a bit about that. He talks about how he's saying basically like the socialists were the people that began indoctrinating people before everyone else. I'm sorry, Christianity. Like he talks about the social aspect of like forming groups,
but he's talking about party politics. So
okay.
Like the Hitler Youth.
Yeah.
Where you would have like, if you're a member of the party, you only associate with other people from the party. You go to a school that's run by the party. Your Freizeitgestaltung, your your whatever free time planning, which is kind of an oxymoron, right? So like like
extracurricular
gymnastics, like Boy Scouts, like to have all that organized under like a politically like party or goal oriented thing. That's the socialist thing, and the fascists, they simply took that over. Or maybe even more accurate, like the socialists simply became national socialists.
Well, but I would still say that this is not this. Whilst he's talking about party politics, this is not something that like is limited to party politics by any means. Like, I think general culture and religion is like, whether intentionally or not, employs these same things. People stay within specific communities. People don't associate with people outside of them.
Right, but it's not necessarily connected to politics.
No, it's not. It's not.
Yeah,
sure.
Which is like simply to say that you want your children to have similar values than you do.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I would say is it does actually still. So you can argue as to whether the goal is good or bad, but even when it comes to like liberal values or like neoliberal values of like individuality and like the American dream and like making your own way and all that stuff, those are also, values that are inculcated from a very young age, right? And they're not necessarily given, right?
Sure, I mean it depends, on where you grow up, and again we get on this question of compulsory education. But I guess the difference to religion is that usually with the religious communities, you would send your child to the religious school because you want your child to grow up with the same values as you do. Whereas with the socialist, or even a national socialist indoctrination, it was more a point where the children were being taken by the state and the parents didn't really know what they were being taught in school. Which we actually watched a movie about this in high school, which is about you had this 40, 50-year-old generation of parents in like early Nazi Germany, which really did not believe in the Nazi goals at all. Yeah. But their children would obviously go to public school. So the children would come home and spout all this shit, and the parents were so shocked, but they couldn't disagree with it.
Sure.
The children would report their parents.
Yeah.
So I guess that's the big difference to religion, is that it's a state organized indoctrination of the children.
It's not something that's directed by parents.
Yeah.
Unless you do live in a state religion, a religious state. Yeah.
True. Okay. So Hayek says labor socialism grew up in liberal capitalism. It took over liberal institutions and ideals. It created a new industrial upper class, the college-educated engineers, etc. And then National Socialism, or fascism, grew up in the world of labor socialism, not in the world of liberalism. So the National Socialists had no more illusions about perfect equality or, that planning can actually address all the needs of different groups. They knew that democratic consensus over planning is impossible. So the new underclass that was, promised equality under labor socialism but didn't get equality, they simply furthered the goals of this new middle upper class. They knew that, they simply had to become the most loudest popular group to direct the benefits of planning to themselves. So that's how he describes this transition from liberalism to social or labor socialism to national socialism. That labor socialism, we had workers' unions and so on, but a lot of the spoils just went to the union heads and the educated people in the unions.
Right.
And then we had this new class of unemployed people, and this would, for example, talk about minimum wage, right? Unions always fight for minimum wage, but one of the results necessarily is that there's more unemployment. So labor socialism creates a new class of quote-unquote exploited people, if you want to use that terminology. And then those people, they won't have any more illusions about planning will make everyone equal. They know that if we become the guys in charge, we can fuck them.
Okay. Interesting perspectives. I need to piss really badly. Can't
Same, actually. Let's take a break.
Break!
Boys. Book boys.
Hello, book babes. Our discussion of the road to serfdom ended up being much longer than anticipated, so we decided to split the episode up into 2 parts. After the discussion, we attempted to record a short outro for part 1. However, due to heat-induced delirium and overconsumption of warm cheese, Nick forgot to press record into the microphone. Nick is already preparing an apology statement and will thus resign from Book Boys effective immediately. His replacement will be Nick 2.0, an artificial intelligence and language model. Everyone please give a warm welcome to Nick 2.0, who will make his debut in a month when we read Slavoj Žižek's The Sublime Object of Ideology.
And so on and so on.
Boys. Book boys.